So, a little bit about Chorus. We are a not-for-profit community effort dedicated to making open research work. Our goals are to help our main stakeholders of publishers, institutions, and funders enhance the value of their open research. We work to spotlight research objects like datasets, software, user facilities, etc. We work with our stakeholders to improve the overall quality of their metadata related to open research, and we host forums and workshops like today's work to connect the stakeholders so they can learn and hopefully build trust and integrity together. So now I'm going to turn over to our moderator, Matt Kennan from Taylor & Francis, to kick us off. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Howard. I'm Matt Cannon. I'm the Associate Director for Open Science Programmes at Taylor & Francis, based in Oxford in the UK, and I'm a current Chorus board member. I'm joined by a truly expert panel today, and I'm really looking forward to the presentation and discussion. So research data management is a topic that continues to be relevant. Firstly, data sharing is a key pillar of open science, which is now enshrined as a UNESCO recommendation, showing how important it is for the future of trusted research. We see continued interest and adoption from funders, publishers, libraries, institutions, and researchers, all looking to play their part in turning the concepts of research data management, such as the FAIR principles, into reality. To assist with this transition, we're seeing new tools available to measure the uptake by researchers and then measure the downstream value to the wider ecosystem. And finally, generative AI is making it easier than ever to create things that look like research papers. And so for readers and other users of pieces of published research, it's more important than ever to have access to the data behind a published study. Data availability is becoming a trust marker for readers to look for when searching for new studies to inform their research. Each of our panelists today is representing at least one stakeholder from the scholarly communications ecosystem. They will give a short talk about recent work, perspectives, or projects, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Firstly, we'll have Kirsty Merrett from the University of Bristol in the UK representing libraries. Libraries are often the first port of call for many researchers when looking for guidance or advice on data sharing. Librarians are often tasked with reporting on the various activities of the staff of their institution, and increasingly, this includes data sharing. Secondly, Laetitia Bracco from the Université de Lorraine, today representing the Open Science Monitoring Initiative, or OSMI. The Open Science Monitoring Initiative's goals are to promote the worldwide adoption of the principles of open science monitoring, provide recommendations for technical specifications of their implementation, and to support stakeholders on various levels in monitoring open science practices. OSMI has provided a much needed solution of bringing together a whole range of stakeholders to tackle this important topic. Thirdly, Rebecca Taylor-Grant is the Director for Open Science and Innovation at Taylor & Francis. Publishers are involved in the process of data sharing from setting and implementation of journal-level policies, setting out the minimum expectations for researchers when publishing in a journal. Increasingly, there are efforts in supporting authors through this process and enforcing these policies via editorial teams and internal staff, which creates new challenges and opportunities. And finally, we have Elizabeth Newbold. Her day job is with the Science and Technology Facilities Council, STFC, and she also sits on one of the advisory boards of UKRI, so bringing both a lab and a funder perspective on research data management developments. Many of the initiatives we've seen to promote data sharing in recent years have been a mixture of community grassroots movements and top-down policy. So Elizabeth's dual experience means she'll have a unique insight to share with us today. As Howard said, please do add any questions or comments in the chat and we'll use them for the Q&A part of the session at the end. Additionally, speakers may wish to provide clarifications or answer questions while the other speakers are talking. Okay, so I think that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Kirsty for the first presentation.
Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, whatever your time zone is. I'm Kirsty Merrett from the University of Bristol. I'm the lead for research data management at the Research Data Service, and we work within library services. And I'm here to kind of hopefully set up a bit of a context for the others that are coming after me in terms of what we do from an institutional perspective, what we do if we're the people at the coalface, in other words. Could I have the next slide, please? So who we are, Bristol, quite a big university in southwest England, what would be called a red brick over here, one of the old Victorian ones from one of the old industrialised cities, old city, old university. UK top 10, world top 50, all of those things that you would expect that go alongside those kinds of prestigious positions, Russell Group, etc. In short, this is not just a trumpet blowing exercise. This is we're not too shabby, but it's relevant because other people's mileage may differ. And in my time in research data management, it would be really unfair to not say that not everyone is in the position that Bristol is in, and not every country is in the position that we are with research data management. So that's a huge caveat for my other RDM peeps out there who may not be quite as well-resourced or have as much buy-in as we have here. So next slide, please. So we're quite a long-established research data service. We do the things that a research data service would be expected to do, the standard things, okay? So we run live and on-demand training. We do bespoke training. We do one-to-ones with people. We provide guidance and advice on data management planning, which now is mostly supported via DMP online for us. We have our own institutional version of that, mainly because by now, writing a data management plan really should be business as usual for most researchers. We advise on data storage, whether that's short-term, medium-term, long-term, if people are out in the field or coming back, etc. And then we also, because of some of the things we do slightly differently at Bristol, we have a bigger impact probably on research design, because we know that we need to maximize data sharing through our repository, which has restricted, open and controlled data set levels. So that means that because we can really offer a as open as possible, as closed as necessary service to our researchers, we need to make sure that we can check for disclosure risk. So we've got a disclosure risk assessment service, and we've got consent and participant information sheets that are spot on for expecting what we would when we want to share data, but also for the understanding of the participants. But also that we know that we can package things up into different bundles as the research is being designed to make sure that it can be shared. But this is quite important for us at Bristol because we're one of the first repositories to offer this, and other repositories have now kind of taken some of what we've done and adapted it for their own use. So Leeds is one of them, Queen's University Belfast is another. And so it means that we're able to offer something slightly different to researchers, which is more in line with what you would expect for it to be as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And it fundamentally changes how researchers can approach their research. So we've done our first open data set was 15 years ago. Our first restricted one was 10 years ago. Almost 13% of what we've got, there are some access restrictions because it's cohort data, or there may be some form of interview data or something where the content is just slightly sensitive. So we want to make sure that it's controlled in terms of putting that out to researchers who really would want to use it. And as part of having a system which means that it can be slightly difficult to write your own data availability statement, we provide those for our researchers when we publish the repository. And this will become apparent, the relevance of this, as I go on. Next slide, please. So we do internal work and external work in addition to that business as usual, which is we were quite involved with writing the University of Bristol's open research policy, getting that on the table and getting the ball rolling with it. But also we wrote the data management policy. My colleagues in library services wrote the open access policy. We're currently working on the co-produce policy. We've kind of got oversight of all of them because data is in all of those sub-policies. So it's important to us that we get this right. We also work quite extensively with the UK reproducibility network, either through doing work for them, like running training sessions for them or working on their projects or as a partner. And in this particular presentation today, I want to talk about one specific thing that we did, which was our work in the Open Research Indicators pilot, the final report of which was published in February of this year. I have the next slide, please. So there were 6 pilots, all about increasing the uptake of open research practices. How can we measure? 3 of them, the ones that I've highlighted, let's call those the data pilots. So the prevalence and quality of data availability statements, fairness of data and the openness of data. And Bristol was the lead for the openness of data. Next slide, please. So on our pilot, I mean, it was a huge endeavour. And most of the institutions, essentially, whilst we were all working together on each other's pilots, we mostly did the majority of the work on our own pilot because there was just so much of it. We worked with different solutions providers. In our case, it was the 4 that I mentioned there. And the aim was to co-create that transparent and ethical and accurate indicator so we could determine how open data was and what we actually counted as open data in the first instance. But the key consideration for us was that how open is the data that we want to get to measure how open data is. It was very difficult to work with some of the proprietary systems and the permissions that were required. So we had to identify things that we could really focus on, but then also look at patterns and barriers to us, to openness of data, and promote, embed, and align those best practices. So this is why we think that Bristol had something that actually made a bit of a difference. Next slide, please. So the methodology, all of the pilots agreed that the best thing to do was to use the data availability statement. It is a central point of analysis and a central point of failure, sadly. So the quality of those is incredibly important. And no doubt Rebecca will be talking a bit about that later in the Tier 2 project. So we chose all articles that had been used, open access articles in 2023, once it had been published then. And then those solutions providers gave us different options with machine learning tools, algorithms, to extract and refine the data to the specifications that we had provided. Then we used their data sets and we checked it against 500 records. So basically by eye, we went through and said, did they get this right? Did they get this wrong? Are they missing something? Is the DOI right? Did it pick up the data access statement? And Bristol's done quite a lot of work with data access statements because we were quite hopeful that we would get some good results from Bristol because we produce our own. You can see there's a little infographic at the side there, which is not rendered particularly well, but it just says, it gives you the statements that you should use. Next slide, please. So what we discovered across the pilots is that whilst the extraction rates were really high, their interpretation and accuracy was actually quite low, and it varied wildly. But the machine readability, their ability to read access conditions, for the algorithm to differentiate on request from the author from on request from a repository, one of which we would count as being open data and one of which we would not, or even things like if there was complex data access levels, there was more than one way of accessing the data or more than one data set to access. It was very difficult, unless it said the data is available at this repository with this DOI under these conditions, it really struggled. So there was some also disparity across the disciplines. It was a bit weak on cohort data, and it doesn't necessarily reflect how archives or museums might store, cite, curate their data. So it was good on the simplest of cases. But for us, when we looked at our Bristol specific articles, the maximum accuracy was where the researcher had used the specific data availability statement we had emailed to them. So we know that that was hitting all the right buttons for the algorithms. Next slide, please. So from doing that pilot, we ultimately said, well, at the moment, we're not comfortable that it's accurate, transparent, and ethical to produce that indicator, because any improvements year on year would be an improvement in how the algorithm picks things up rather than improvement on the practice. And that's quite important for us because we want to know that the underlying practice has changed. And essentially what we determined was that you can't use quantitative tools to measure something that acts like qualitative data without some form of controlled language. You can't teach the algorithms, you can't teach the machine learning to pick up the things that it needs to. So whilst we could put controlled language in, no doubt we'll be having some more discussions about this later, it's a bit more complex though than just improving algorithms, because there's the language and the terminology that the publishers, the funders use. There's the research culture itself. Is this business as usual? Are we factoring in time for doing these things, for even sharing data? Is there differences in disciplines? In the infrastructure, you might not be able to share sensitive data, the training that's required. So those are the points where there's a bit of fudge room and you may or may not be able to gain some ground. And then also that from us, we're thinking that essentially funders, publishers, initiatives and institutions all need to speak the same language. We need to be using the same terminology or same sets of terminology if it's discipline specific. We need templates and metadata standards for data citation and curation. And we need to know where data access statements should be. Next slide, please. So how do we affect these changes? Well, you may wonder why there's a picture of Concord. That's because Concord was built in Bristol and in Toulouse. It was an enterprise between Britain and France. I know we do those things. That's quite strange, isn't it? Who would think that? Concorde took its last flight back into Bristol. So for me, that idea of pushing the envelope, which is pushing the flight envelope, it's an aeronautical term. It's not to do with stationary, is to be involved in that wider conversation. So we need to collaborate with those initiatives and innovations and projects, just like we did with Concorde, and engage with solution providers and stakeholders locally and globally to keep on pushing those boundaries and making sure that we can make a change. So that should set up my French counterpart to start talking about OSMI shortly. That's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. So yeah, over to you, Laetitia.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for this wonderful introduction. I'll try to be up to the role you gave me. So I'm very happy to be with you today. So I'm Laetitia Bracco. I work at the Université de Lorraine as Deputy Head of Library Research Support Services, but I'm here with my hat of Chair of the OSMI Coordination Committee. Next, please. So we founded the Open Science Monitoring Initiative for a reason, several reasons actually, and I wanted to share with you those initial questions that we had. Next, please. So you may or may not remember that in May 2023, there was this meeting of Ministry Science Ministry for the G7 that was held in Japan. And a very strong statement was issued after this meeting, basically saying that G7 cooperation on open science should continue, but with a framework for monitoring the progress and obstacles of open science, because it's really important to have policies at the national institutional level, but if we are not able to monitor the actual progress and implementation of those policies, it's quite hard to steer the progress and to improve. Next, please. So thinking about this, in France, but also with other colleagues from other countries, we started to dig a little bit what was existing, and we realized that there were already many existing monitoring initiatives, many also guidelines, but none of those guidelines were specific to monitoring. So on the left side of the screen, you see some European examples of national or institutional monitors. Of course, we have in France the French Open Science Monitor, but you have all kinds of monitors, whether it be at the national or institutional level. You also have monitors from publishers. Those are really a few examples. You also had international initiatives such as the UNESCO Open Science Monitoring Working Group or the Curtin University's Open Knowledge Initiative, COKI. But actually, none of those are working in the same way. And that's mostly because, well, all countries, institutions have their own agenda, obviously, but also because there were no available guidelines for those, because we had the principles of open scholarly infrastructure in 2021, of course, the UNESCO recommendation on open science 2021, then the UNESCO Open Science Outlook, and more recently, the Declaration on Open Research Information, the Barcelona Declaration, but none of those were actually addressing monitoring specifically. Next, please. So this is why we created OSMI. So at the beginning, OSMI was, it was kind of an idea working in open science monitoring for France and with other countries. Yeah, we thought that we really needed those guidelines, and this stirred a lot of interest from other institutions, other countries. So we had this first workshop at UNESCO in 2023 with participants from all over the world. And drawing from this initial workshop, well, we thought about what we could actually do to create those guidelines. So we prepared a first draft that we opened to public consultation, and we were able to publish the principles of open science monitoring, and they were really created to address this gap. So it's really this text, which is the starting point of the Open Science Monitoring Initiative, OSMI. So as Matt said during his introduction, the main goal of OSMI is to promote the adoption of those principles, also to provide recommendations for technical specifications and to support stakeholders generally. And I wanted to insist that OSMI does not aim to create monitoring dashboards itself. We have no mandate to monitor anyone. It's really a space where people can discuss. And currently we are around 200 participants in OSMI from all over the world, with 4 working groups and a representation from all continents within our board. Next slide. So to dig a little bit more into the principles of open science monitoring themselves. Next, please. So here are the high-level principles. You have in the text those 3 parts: relevance and significance, transparency and reproducibility, self-assessment, and responsible use. So those 3 high-level principles are the result of the consultation. They are quite close to the first draft that we had, well, the titles, but the contents were really, really enriched by the consultation, which is a process of several months. We gathered input from nearly 50 different countries. So as you can see, it's a highly collaborative process that gave birth to this text. And the main things about it is that are the principles you see here. All open science monitoring initiatives should be well-defined, relevant, adaptable to diverse research contexts. Open science monitoring should, wherever possible, prioritize the use of open, transparent, and reproducible information. So this seems to be obvious, but sometimes it's better to say it because, yeah, it's better to do open science monitoring with open source code on open databases, for example. And also, we wanted to emphasize the fact that principles of open science monitoring should not be used to create new rankings, but on the contrary, to help monitor improvements and to incentivize good open science practices. So this is the text. And next slide, please. You can download it in many languages. It's already available in 10 different languages. This text is really for all stakeholders to help create better open science monitoring systems. So it's useful for initiatives already doing some monitoring, because that way you can see where are your strengths and weaknesses and see if, well, you can actually improve the way you are monitoring open science. And it's also a way to start from the right feet, I would say, with all those recommendations. And if you want to know more, I warmly recommend you to go and visit our website. Next slide. So really quickly, an example of how we implemented those principles, and well, they were existing before the principles, so now we are able to improve what we're doing with the French Open Science Monitor, because I wanted to give you a small overview of what we do for research data. Next. So in the French Open Science Monitor, you do have two indicators, two series of indicators, I would say, for research data. So the first one is about dataset mentions, within the full text of publications. So we have those indicators at the national level, and they are analyzing some practices, so usage, creation, and sharing of datasets. So you can see that this is getting better, but we still have a long way to go. Next. And the other range of indicators that we have are about data sets published in repositories. So this is really useful for institutions to know actually where their researchers are actually publishing their data sets. And with that, I'm wrapping up my presentation, and I'll be really happy to hear the next presentations. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Laetitia. That was great. Okay, moving on to publishers next. I can hand over to Rebecca.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. So I'm Director of Open Science Strategy and Innovation at Taylor & Francis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about publisher data policies and some projects we've been involved with to help, I guess, to implement our policies better. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of context. I think publishers are really a key stakeholder in data sharing in general, just because of where we are in the research life cycle. So when someone is coming to the point in their research project where they want to publish, they're really motivated at that point to align with our policy requirements. And what we're starting to see is that kind of the point of publication is more and more reflected in other stakeholder policies. For example, Cancer Research UK or the NIH will say that the point at which their grantees need to share data is the point at which they're publishing. So there's kind of a role for the journal in making sure that that happens. Obviously, a key outcome of data sharing policies on a journal is that the data is shared, but also often a data availability statement. And I think it's interesting, both Kirsty and Laetitia have referred to data availability statements or data access statements as being this evidence that a researcher has shared their data. It's where you can find information about how the data was shared. Next slide. So lots of journals now have data sharing policies, but actually enforcing those policies can be really challenging. When you compare what it takes to enforce a data sharing policy on a journal, the checks are actually really complex compared to other editorial policies. So often with an editorial policy, it'll be more of a binary check. So is something present or is it absent? Whereas there's loads of complexity to checking against a data sharing policy. And in the background of the slide, I just have a mapping. We were trying to map internally what are all the checks that need to happen on a manuscript when data is supposed to have been shared. And these checks tend to happen like quite soon after submission, and they're undertaken often by administrators or journal editorial office who really don't have a deep disciplinary knowledge of data sharing. So they can undertake kind of surface checks of a manuscript, but they wouldn't necessarily know like what's the right repository for a particular type of data. And this can really introduce a risk for the journal because you don't want to have a policy that's mandating data availability statements, and then you're publishing really poor quality statements, undermining the credibility of the research you're publishing. And also you can't even fix them without making a formal correction to the paper. So if you click, next slide. Yeah, this is just an example of a submitted data availability statement, which we did not publish. But you can imagine if you're not doing your checks properly, authors can write all kinds of weird and wonderful things and submit it. Next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about two different projects that are aiming to, I guess, improve checking, but with the goal of enforcing data policies better and then making research more transparent and more reproducible. So the first one is Tier 2. If we go to the next slide. Tier 2 was a huge project, like really big scale, funded by Horizon Europe, and it wrapped up at the end of last year. And I'm really just touching on a tiny part of it, and all of their outputs were super interesting. So do check it out if you're interested. One of the projects we were involved with was on data policy and kind of manuscript handling. So the idea that as a manuscript goes from submission to publication, there are many people and teams involved in that process. And we did a bit of a mapping in terms of who in those teams might have data expertise or not, and also how prevalent are they. So you can see at the bottom of our pyramid, most journals will have, or all journals will have peer reviewers and editors, and often typesetters and production editors. But those people don't necessarily have a lot of data sharing expertise. Then at the top of our pyramid, we have data editors, and obviously they have a lot more expertise, but fewer journals have them. So next slide. So the output of the Tier 2 project was this editorial reference handbook that was developed collaboratively with a really big group of publishers. And it's a very comprehensive guide to what does it mean to implement a more stringent data policy? Like, what does it take to have an open data policy on a journal? And it includes a list of checks. So what are all the things that need to be checked and enforced? And also a model workflow with all of the roles who will be involved. So as the manuscript passes through, who's handling it? What should they be checking at each stage? So next slide, please. So again, in the background of the slide, I just have a screenshot of the workflow because it's somewhat complicated, which I think is interesting. But basically, the handbook itself is outlining those fundamental requirements to support data sharing, but also to give editors an overview of what's needed. So if you're thinking maybe this is a policy you'd like to enforce, what does it actually take to do that? And who are the key roles and what are the responsibilities that will be needed? So I have on the slide a link to the handbook and would really recommend you check it out. So next slide, please. So the second project I wanted to touch on is, of course, about AI, because as you can imagine, there's significant, at least perceived potential in terms of what an AI tool could check. So we've been collaborating with an AI open science solution provider called DataSeer to experiment in how AI can help us with our checking workflow. Next slide. So what we've seen is that when it comes to authors submitting manuscripts with data availability statements, they tend to often make the same mistakes. So you'll have manuscripts submitting with the statements missing. When data should be shared openly, often you'll see authors will share on request. Sometimes authors, instead of giving us a link to a data repository, will link us to private file sharing sites, so maybe a Google Drive or a Dropbox. Kind of harder to spot where they should have given us a DOI or a persistent identifier. Some authors will give us a URL or even a private peer review link. And also authors sometimes ask for unacceptable exemptions. So there are legitimate reasons why data can't be shared. For example, maybe it's just too sensitive or you didn't have participant consent. But we will have authors asking for exemptions for reasons like I don't want to, or my co-author doesn't want to. So you can imagine these are kind of ripe for AI type checks. So next slide, please. So this is just a really high-level overview of what the tool is doing for us, and I can definitely talk about this in more depth if people would like to. So the author submits their manuscript to our journal submission system. We have an API integration with DataSeer that sends the manuscript out. We get a report back, and then that actually goes to our administrators. So this is not AI doing the checks and then passing or failing. The report gets sent to the administrator, and they make a decision on what the author should do next. But actually, we've seen such good accuracy from DataSeer that we're experimenting with DataSeer drafting bespoke author guidance, because this is the thing our administrators really struggle with. Like if there's something really specific that the author should have done and they didn't, kind of knowing what guidance should be given, and DataSeer is really good at that. Now, next slide. So this is just a screenshot of, it's actually a mock-up. It doesn't look exactly like this in our system, but this is what our administrator could see, or an administrator could see from a DataSeer output. So you can see what the tool is checking is compliance against the different elements of the policy, and then it's really easy to see where something is non-compliant because you've got like a red no saying that something needs to be changed. And that's how our administrators can give feedback to the author. So next slide, and it's my last one, I think. Yeah, just to summarize, I think what we've learned, like being in this space and having these policies rolled out for a number of years, is that introducing the policy and enforcing the policy are really not the same. And when you introduce a data policy, particularly an open data policy, it involves introduction of like significant complexity into checks. We do a lot of training with our administrators to make sure that they know how to check incoming manuscripts, and even still, they definitely do struggle with it. Also, I think we've had some standardization around what a data policy on a journal might look like and what it might include for a number of years now, coming out of the RDA. But we actually haven't had a lot of guidance around how the policies should be enforced. And like obviously that's starting to change with things like Tier 2. But I don't think there's been any consistency in what journals have been checking up to now. And then finally, maybe unsurprisingly, there's definitely significant potential for AI to reduce administrative burden in the future. So I think we see lots of opportunity here, which means we can introduce more and stronger data sharing policies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Okay, and now we can move on to our final speaker for today. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Matt. So thanks for having me today, and I'm going to talk about how we've been developing the UKRI research data policy. I'm not actually going to go into detail of what is in the policy. I just wanted to say that up front in case anybody is disappointed. So next slide, please. So just for those of you who don't know, the UKRI is the largest public funder in the United Kingdom, and we cover all disciplines. It's made up of 7 disciplinary research councils, ranging from arts and humanities all the way through to physics, etc. And it also has Research England, who supply and support higher education in England, and Innovate UK, who support innovation. I, as Matt said in the introduction, work at the Science and Technology Facilities Council in the Scientific Computing Department, where I lead on open science. So STFC is a funder in particle physics, astronomy and nuclear physics, but we also run and have research performing activities, and we have the national laboratories as well. And the area I work in, as I don't work on the funding side, I work in the national laboratories, so I come from that perspective of actually having to support researchers in managing their research data as well. And I'm a member of the UKRI Research Data Policy Working Group, who's been developing this research data policy. So that's just a sort of background for where we're coming from. So next slide, please. So it's an update to our policy because actually we do have policies, and we've had policies before, but it's time to do an update on this. And reasons for this are sort of probably self-explanatory, really, and things that previous speakers have already talked about. You know, good research data sharing and management is an important part of doing good research. I mean, we shouldn't have to say that, but we actually do find ourselves having to reiterate that at various points to people. And we want that data from UKRI funded research to be more findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. So we're really bringing out fair aspects in our policy development now. We want to maximise value and impact publicly funded research, ensure reproducibility, transparency, research quality and integrity, and be more open and collaborative. I think it's really important that we recognise that it must be done fairly, safely and transparently. And as we all know, we talk about as open as possible. And now we're sort of moving towards talking about open as possible and only as restricted and secure as necessary. You can still share things, you still want to be open, but we need to obviously consider when you can't share things or when you might have to restrict the sharing of things, might be through a trusted research environment or other mechanisms. And so those are some of the sort of context as to why I'm updating our policy. So next slide, please. So we want a joined-up approach. As I said, UKRI is made up of 7 disciplinary research councils, Research England and Innovate UK. We've been as UKRI since sort of 2018, I think it was, or formally 2016 maybe, can't quite remember, before my time. And we've had separate policies for the different research councils, but it's sort of time now to have an integrated policy. It needs to be collectively developed from across all the different constituent councils, and we've had a working group that brought these together. And one of the reasons we need a joined up approach is we need it easier to navigate and use. And that's the feedback from our researchers, the people that we fund, and people like Kirsty, who's having to support universities and researchers in universities to navigate through the different policies. As one research funder, even though we have different disciplinary focuses and different councils, we do need to make that easier for people to understand what our policies are. We want to be consistent across our funding, but it's really important that we ground this in good practice and be specific for research being undertaken, because we know there are domain differences. Arts and humanities data is not the same as astronomy data. It doesn't mean we can't have a joined up policy, but we need to be recognising that how that policy might be implemented will vary for those different disciplines. And this isn't in isolation as well. There's lots of other things going on in the world, and we need to join up our policies, priorities and investments. So we have digital research infrastructure, there's a talent and skills approach, research culture, trusted research and sustainability. And there's we have IP policies as a funder. We also have an AI strategy as well. So we want to make sure that our policies all sit together and as far as possible can be joined up and work together. So we have a coherent research ecosystem. And next slide, please. So the other aspects are we want to support advances in technology policy and practice. So I said we've had research policies. We had common principles from the research councils, which predate 2016. There was also a concordat on open research data in the UK, which brought together research councils and other bodies. There's been OECD work, but one of the things, for example, our policies don't mention, because actually the FAIR principles hadn't been published at the time, doesn't explicitly mention FAIR. They probably do support it in certain ways because FAIR isn't new, it's just how it's been articulated. So we are building on those strong foundations, and we want to align, as I said before, things that have come out from OECD, UNESCO and other organisations as well. So next slide, please. So what we are thinking and having in this work is we're having common expectations, and with practice guided by your research. As I said, this was a presentation that we've been given to colleagues in the UK as well, hence your research. But it is important that it does reflect how research is undertaken. So at the centre, in the block, we have a UKRI research data policy, which will be a single set of core expectations for all in-scope UKRI research. We'll have common guidance for people applying for UKRI funding around data management plans and questions, and support for research data sharing and curation costs to make that guidance clearer. It won't necessarily mean it's exactly the same in all cases, but the guidance will be clearer. And we will have some data domain specific guidance modules which sit alongside the policy but not part of the core expectations. One of the reasons for that is we hope that a policy, although we will be reviewing it regularly, has a fairly longish lifespan, but we also know that we need to be adaptable and have guidance as and when it's needed, when situations change or when feedback comes that things aren't clear. How do we deal with something? So we can develop that guidance as we go along and be more agile in that, rather than having to do a huge review of a policy. And that takes quite a long time. So we're looking at arts and humanities data specifically, economic and social science data about people, so it's not, which could be regardless of who's funding it. And we're doing quite a lot of work about thinking about how research software fits in with the data policy as well. So we will have our policy expectations, and they should align with best practice and standards for the type of research and data involved, because being multidisciplinary, as we've said, the data can look very different depending on what you're studying and what you're researching. We're also thinking about how we provide guidance to UKRI research facilities. As I said, I work in the national laboratories, we run facilities, but there are also lots of other funded facilities that UKRI fund, which might be based in universities or independent laboratories. And we're not quite sure how we're going to provide guidance to those, whether they need specific guidance or not. And as I said, that's where we look about being a bit more agile about thinking about whether we'll add guidance later on when people have had a chance to work with the policy maybe. So next slide, please. So we have a draft research data policy, and I realise I've not put the link on here, but I will put that in the chat before I leave. And in the policy, we will have a purpose and scope, and then the common requirements, including activities around planning research, what data to share, how to share it, in fair data. One of the key aspects as well is about acknowledgement and recognition of people. I think Kirsty had on her slides about credit and things like that. We want to make sure that everybody involved in the research process gets fair recognition and acknowledgement, citing and reusing data, as well as preservation. And all of this is in the scope of responsible data sharing and acknowledging that there are times when it might not be possible to share the actual data. So we're also looking at requirements around metadata, because there may be not possible to share your data, but it might be possible to share your metadata. And apologies. And as Rebecca mentioned, things like data availability statements, we want to avoid people just saying, oh, I can't share this data. You can be able to say it's embargoed until this long, it will be available. It's available to certain environments under a trusted research agreement or a collaborative agreement and things. So we want to look at responsible data sharing. Next slide, please. We have, as I said, looking at developing supporting guidance. We've had a piece of work that has been done for us from some external consultants, looking at data management plan landscape, and that is informing some of our decisions around what we want to do about data management plans and the approach across UKRI. One thing which we haven't personally, well, I haven't personally been involved in, not necessarily started, and I think this is quite relates back to earlier talks as well, is thinking about monitoring and evaluation of, as people have said, you can put a policy out, but how do you know the policy is doing what you intend it to do, and if its policy itself is successful. And next slide, please. And so where we are now, and this is just the timeline, we started the work in July 2024, hard to sort of nearly 2 years ago now. This is how long it takes to get things done. We had a draft policy which we published in April 2025, which went out for consultation, and we did an extensive amount of consultation in various different ways. We had stakeholder roundtables, different research councils, cross-council, cross-domains, cross different roles involved in it. We had workshops, and we had a sort of open survey with a lot of comments that came back, which was open for anybody. So since then, August ongoing, we've been sort of analysing the feedback, finalising the core policy, working on some of the guidance. As I said, we've had some work on data management plans looked at. We've been doing some more work around research software and what that might mean. And so the aim is to publish the policy in summer, and that's a Northern Hemisphere summer, but broad time, when we'll put out the publish the policy, the guidance, and the first implementation plan for this, with the policy to start at some point in 2027, because obviously we need to put the policy out, and then we need to have a start date, because it can't be just it happens now, because it is linked to funding cycles and things like that. So that's me. Thank you. Oh, you can see our engagement hub. There is the slide there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. Good to, well, I think we all know that sometimes these things take longer than you would like, but it's important to get them right, isn't it? Okay, so Howard has taken the slides down. If the other speakers would like to turn their cameras back on, we can go into some Q&A. So we've had a good question in the chat that I think would be a good point to kick us off. So I think it kind of echoes a point that was made a few different times in the different presentations, saying that data policies are only as good as their enforcement. So I think Rebecca demonstrated that really clearly. But the question is, what practices should be implemented for ensuring that data sharing within articles is still active years after publication? So kind of thinking about long-term preservation and the linking between articles and data sets. I can imagine a few of our speakers may have thoughts on that one. Would anybody like to go first, or shall I?
You know, I'd like to jump in.
Okay, go on, Bracco. You go first.
Although I do think other speakers might have different perspectives. So I completely agree. I think the first thing that's really important is that we move away from share upon request policies, because we know there's a really high attrition rate. Like when you come back after a year, after 2 years, it's just so unlikely that the person you're asking will still have access to the data themselves and be willing to give it to you. So that's one part. And then secondly, I think, like, obviously enforcing policies that ensure data is stored in a repository is better, but having come from a data repository background myself, like, I know the gold standard for digital preservation is 10 years. So, like, I think maybe we need to imagine that not every data set will live forever, or, like, unless we're doing some serious appraisal, maybe it's not worth every data set living forever. And I'm wondering, yeah, do the other panelists agree, or they might have other perspectives?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I mean, so this isn't an official UKRI position on this. This is a personal view. I think it's a really important question, because I think, there are some data sets, and you think about observational data, you can't go back and remeasure the weather, what sort of things. There's different things. But I think it's a real challenge for us, those of us starting to think about what data we want to keep and how do we make those decisions about what data to keep for the long term. And that's because, like, as supporting our researchers, we have a small data repository that supports the data, that is for the data that supports the publication, is how we phrase it. And yeah, we've been saying we'll keep it for 10 years. We've had that repository for nearly 10 years now, and we're now going to have to make a decision about what do we do and how do we do that. And I think we need to start having, I really think we need to start having those conversations about how we make those decisions. Yeah, definitely. And I don't think it will be the same for everybody either. But I think it's definitely a piece of work we need to do as a community.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, I completely agree. This is a really important matter, and I think it's important to also develop some trust for the repositories that we use. And I'm just sharing in the chat the national policy in France about this. We have this list of trusted repositories that we advise researchers to use by discipline. Obviously, we don't have repositories for every discipline, but having a sound preservation strategy for those repositories, and using also persistent identifiers is, I think, a good way to at least start thinking about it, and hopefully things would get better in the future. But we do know that repositories can disappear, so it's also important to support those kinds of infrastructures.
Kirsty, did you have anything you wanted to say about that question?
Yes, I mean, I will be an absolute little tyrant about it and say it should all be done with a data site DOI in a repository, and that's that. It shouldn't be it should be a non-negotiable thing for me, because it's the only way that we can guarantee that there is going to be the data further down the line. And we know that it's done as a snapshot in time as well. We have researchers who publish with us. This is one of the problems we have with DOIs, not necessarily mapping onto the publication timelines in a way that makes it useful. Like Rebecca, you said you might get the secure link to look at something, because researchers might not want to publish it unless they know that it's going to be published, or alternatively, they might not want to publish it until somebody else has sanity checked it, and that might be that extra pair of eyes at the publishers when the peer reviewer looks. But we know that once it's published, that's it, it's done, it's copied, it's a snapshot in time. Now, Elizabeth, I totally understand what you're saying. Like, moving forward, you think if that data set's never been accessed in 25 years' time, is it really worth keeping it and using, we've got the environmental costs of saving that much, having that much data storage further down the line. So it's not quite as simple as we need to make sure that everything's available, because we do need to have that kind of sanity check on whether or not, if things have never been used, whether it's worth the environmental costs of keeping it.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties into, I think you just answered one of the supplementary questions that's gone into the chat. And I think I know what my answer would be, but I'll put it to the panel. One of the audience has proposed that publishers should be responsible for hosting data similarly to how supplementary materials are assigned DOIs. I think, Kirsty, you said kind of data site DOIs, saying formally, which comes from data repositories. I guess the panel may also have views on that and reasons why we're all proposing that repositories are the best place for data to be
I would
stored.
definitely not be comfortable with publishers holding the data. And this is no disrespect to the publishers that are on the call, but not all publishers are created equal. And I don't want there to be even the slightest possibility of somebody not being able to get that data further down the line, or it might be monetized or lost, or, you know, data repositories are there because we're the experts in data curation and maintaining that data long term. So that's why I think it should stick as a separate function and you know, kind of away from money function where at all possible.
I think having worked in a repository and now working with a publisher, it's like at a surface level, it's making content accessible, but the kind of infrastructure behind it is so different. And I previously worked at F1000, which is a publisher who did host data. So they made it their business to create a repository for data and then abandoned the idea because it's just such a different premise, and even the checks that need to go in before you make that accessible, just not a good idea. So I would say as a publisher, no, we definitely don't want to host data. But maybe that's just me.
Okay, fantastic. I think there are other questions in the chat about DMPs, but maybe there's a whole other session that we can do about data management plans and whether they've fulfilled their potential and whether there's more we can do with DMPs. But we're coming up on time and I need to give Howard at least a minute at the end. So I'll just say thank you so much to all the speakers for their wonderful presentations and all the preparation they've done for this session, and hand it back to Howard.
There's always never enough time when we have great speakers, and this was a really great session. So thanks to everyone for participating. Thanks to all who gave us great questions in the chat. Matt, thank you for moderating and pulling in those questions. And also thank you to our sponsors, AIP Publishing, Molecular Connections, and STM, because without them, we couldn't have done it. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your week. We hope you have a good one.